So if you never know about a poetry book, what most people do is they read the first poem and the last poem. Yeah. So, I mean, that's fine. So you just look, because there's so lots of books, you read them, no, then you just put it away. So I thought I may as well start with the first poem and the last poem, and you can decide whether you might get the collection. It's a terribly big collection. Anyway, never mind. And the first poem in a book is always, you're trying to sort of say something about the whole collection in a first poem. And this first poem is a poem, I mean, it looks like that. How it looks on the page is very important to me. And the reason it looks like that is because each verse is what's called a stanza pattern. So that each line is has got a metrical feet to it. Can't remember what it is now, and it follows that pattern. The metrical feet, if you're interested in those things, are exactly the same each verse, and it's got a rhyme pattern, a very difficult rhyme pattern that has to be repeated each verse as well. And it's in one sentence. When I was describing this to a friend of mine, they said it sounds like mental self-harm. It's called These Days. These Days. The sun at sunflower height makes the usual lanterns in the gorse, pine twigs bright as Golgi's pictures of the brain, where nerves show up in silver nitrate. And although the breeze is just enough to nod the Queen Anne's lace, nothing pleases. Our human calculus precedes the given world. Whatever seeds we plant will grow in time, the error bred in the bone, the daily rancour of the mind, our clever ways to be unkind, will spoil the morning, disinclined as we so often are to watch this equal sunlight sculpt the day, a repertoire of olive green and cinnabar, from risen moon to evening star. So the last poem is a rhyming sonnet in terza rima. Look that one up. You don't actually need to know that, but anyway, I quite like the technicalities. And I wanted to have this as an art poem because the collection is called Yarn. It's a lot about stories. The stories we tell ourselves. Are those stories true or not? And in my mind, they then become bedtime stories. So I wanted to put us to bed at the end. Owl Night. All day the wind has ranged across the valley. It gave the pines their hour, thrushed their branches, milled their tops. And now the limestone ridges scoured into a milking non-existence. The day is sealed. The mountains tower beyond the pale, deleted distance. You can hear the birds' arcade, the wind undoing its persistence. Nature's apple colours fade. I wash my cup and scrub a saucepan, then go to bed. The debt is paid. Consciousness is overrun. The owl's one hoot tells night to come. And the trouble with writing these little lyrics is they kill you to write. That's taken me about 5 years to write that. And at the end of it, people go, "Oh, that's quite nice." You know, that's all you get from them. They're like little chocolates. You know, just, "Oh, yeah, that's quite a nice one." Oh God! You just think, why do I do it? I'm absolutely mad. Let's try and read a funny one. I've only got one funny one. I'm quite funny in life, but in poems I'm terribly sad. One's called My Mother Driving. I don't need to explain it because it explains it. There's nothing very obscure about my poems, although somebody said to me the other day, I couldn't help noticing that there's obscurities in them. And I go, oh my God, is there? And then he told me one. I thought, oh yes, that is obscure. Anyway, there's nothing in this obscure, except for when I showed it to my brother, he said, I didn't know what I meant by avant-garde. The first line is, my mother was never one of the avant-garde. And I said, well, that is obscure. What I mean is the avant-garde of feminism. Yeah. Anyway, but you wouldn't get that. My mother driving. My mother was never one of the avant-garde, though she'd reverse coaches up our yard with the best of them. Left hand down a bit. Such were the days of oil and Duraglit. A small woman with pale and freckled arms, 5 children, and working for the coach firm, she drove so fast my father would have to say, "We might enjoy the countryside today if only your mother would slow down." The run to Perranporth was long and through the night. B roads, lonely windscreen wiper sound, with 4 boys in the back, an Alsatian, my sister on my father's lap. She'd wait until he nodded off, then put her foot down. So that's what you try to do in poems. They put a foot. You have at least 2 obvious meanings from that, and that's what starts to mean more than itself. You know, Frost said famously, "Why not have it mean everything?" So you're always trying to do that somehow, have it mean everything, and of course that's impossible because you have to say something. You can't say everything, but the aim of poetry is to use words to say something that somehow says everything. Yeah, it's really pretty nearly impossible to do, but some poets do manage it. Frost manages it, all the great poets manage it at times at their very best. Why not have it mean everything? So this is a poem about depression. I've been rather vulnerable to depression myself. I think, looking back on it, I think I was depressed when I was 13. I was very unhappy as a child. And depression is one of the things that they think gets sort of hardwired. It becomes a kind of habit of mind, that your mind just runs in that direction and when you're not attending to it. And it can be very sort of distressing because you think you were fine a minute ago and suddenly you're not fine. And how do you suddenly go from being fine to being not fine? Luckily we've got much more understanding of depression now. People used to just say, well, you know, you just pull your socks up, and of course that used to make it worse. Anyway, there are some more confessional poems in this, which I always thought I would never write confessional poems, but never say never. So this is a poem about depression, called rather surprisingly, The Dolphin. I thought I got it from Larkin, but I've never been able to find it in Larkin, so I might have made it up. It's called The Dolphin. Again, it swims back into view, the dolphin of depression, grey-eyed, grey, and jumping through the burning hoops of passion, then diving to a colder district, shadow, a wheel of shadow, where eels and multicoloured fish, the hopes for my tomorrow. I won't be jealous anymore. I'll concentrate. All this, and love, of course, the bedroom door shut tight, makes much amiss, as another poet said. A wasteful sun comes out and daylight sparks a coral bed. The quivering water spout, a rippling stalk that holds aloft the beach ball of delight to whoops and cheers, is tempest-tossed and falls. The show is blighted, and again it swims back into view, the dolphin of depression. The grin is false, the song untrue, the tricks are out of fashion. For those of you interested in technicality, it's a ballad. Yeah. So I'll read, don't know what I'll read. I'll read some of these, I'll read some of the elegies that Gaurav was mentioning. If you thought they're miserable, you went to these ones. It's a sequence called April Elegies. I thought I'd read this one because I haven't read this one before. This is the first one I wrote, which I then changed later on, but it's called Tumbalalaika. Does anyone know Tumbalalaika? No? A lovely Yiddish song. Tumbalalaika. I saw a blackbird in the restaurant garden on the day after you died. He was busy in the light that seemed too bright, too much like summer. You won't be coming back as he has, year after year. There'll be no more Yiddish songs for us to sing. Tumbala, tumbala, tumbala leika. no faces pulled in a stuffy room. Your love of chicory in the backs of buildings, the way you use felt tips, all that's in question now, along with wood smoke hazy in the park and the nervy crowns of tulips. I hold up your shirts, try on your gloves, ask if I can keep the figure of a saint standing on an inlaid wooden box, and your watch, the split across the strap where the buckle went, still marking the size of your wrist. Of course, I didn't realise at the time, but the question of that's the watch, which is now completely broken, but I'm sort of wearing it as, it doesn't tell the time anymore. In fact, it does tell the time, but it's not that time. But your wrist and his mother and so on. So this one's called Souls, and of course, well, it's an attempt to think of what happens when you die. And I don't know what happens when you die, and nobody knows what happens when you die. People think they know, but they just believe things, including that you die. It's just a belief. It's a belief. It's not a fact. It's a belief disguised as a fact. Nobody knows what happens when you die. So this is me trying to write about that anyway. Souls. I don't believe that souls are turned to birds. Watch them on the lawn. The blackbirds stab the muddy grass for worms. I don't believe that souls transform to deer that track us from a wood, remembering their former human forms. I don't believe that when the trumpet sounds, the soul is given back its mortal flesh as brightly burning coals. I don't believe the soul migrates and wears a different body with each life, or like a water drop dissolves. They say we each live on in the gestures of a child, but that doesn't count for you. No father to a son. So what can I conclude on your departure? That nothing came of it? With everything undone? Coal wool. This is, some of you have been to Adhisthana. That's the stop you get off at Adhisthana. Coal wool. Tired and still inside my London head, I walked up Oyster Hill when suddenly, and poet-like, a trill high above me sounded as sharp and clear as any hedge or lane lover might hear, Hardy say, still in his time-torn prime, as if the very branch was singing to the sky, and no mischance could make England lessen a green design in summer weather. I should have banished mine. These watercolour clouds and swabs of blue, this robin, I see him now, can't assuage us for the world we know, your mother's war. I should have thought of you. The world has grown too simple and too true. So I'll read this one about this dream I had. Actually, I'll read this little one first because it's at its bedtime one. Called 5 Years On. I wrote this one because I wrote a long sequence of poems, 9 pages worth, of him talking back to me from using a travelogue in rhyme, as it happens, as you do. But I decided not to use it in the collection. So all I've got left of this great big long thing that took ages to try and write is 2 verses of 5 lines. That just goes on. It's called 5 Years On. 5 years on in blossom time, your voice is coming back. When all I thought you'd left behind were things, a broken watch strap, I find you talk to me in rhyme, 5 years on in blossom time. But 5 years on is 5 years dead, so this can't be your voice, saying things you might have said, making a wiser choice from twists and turnings up ahead, 5 years on and 5 years dead. So I'll read this. I'll read 2 more from this and then I'll read something else. I'll read this poem about the dream, which is in rhyming couplets. It's interesting, sometimes in a form, you find a form. So this is a little... I've been trying to think how to write about this dream for ages. I'd written 2 other attempts. And I was cycling home from babysitting, and I could suddenly hear this music. And then, there's a poem. And I stopped, and I didn't have a notebook, and I didn't have a pen, which is, for me, you know, an act of unmindfulness of unparalleled, you know. So I had to go and find a shop, buy a notebook and a pen. As I did so, I could hear the music just disappearing, and I just got the first few lines of it down before it left me. And even then I thought, oh no, it's in rhyming couplets, as you do. We've all been there. And then I was right to say as no, because it's taken me forever to finish it. Anyway, it's terribly sad. It's called Zofia, which is Mohananda's mother's name, and therefore includes her story. You had to find your way without breathing, and you did. You walked, surprised how easy now it was to leave the world behind. But then the usual torments came. You'd find your mother again, stepping off the boat, a handbag with its handle worn or broken, no shoes, no coat, no language she could speak. And that was where it started. London and peace, peace after war, but not, you said, for her. You had to listen to each recounted horror, the agreed-on vase of flowers left in a window, a sign that it was safe and no Gestapo searched the house. But how this time the plan went wrong, and fear too big to understand entered every life. You stepped inside my dream to tell me with a kind of pride, your words a muddled rush, how death had come, how foolish all your fears had been, and wrong, a song you stumbled through on your accordion, how everything made sense, the fumbled facts, your father's Bible, the burning books and maps, the camps, even the European stain found its settled place. There was no pain in your voice, nothing like a cry or moan. You were still the social man I'd known, warm and garrulous in company. You told me all of this and then embraced me. Today I had to cycle to the street by Primrose Hill where, one damp night, McNeice lay listening to the cutting down of trees, clearing the hill's crest for light artillery, the view prepared, searchlights probing heaven for the bacilli of war. But that was then. Your then still seems to me, and now. Your plan, when you got back from China and Xi'an, where you'd seen the terracotta soldiers facing east to guard the old Qin emperor, was to concentrate on the inward journey, but not as far as this. I have your house key, so I lock my bike and open up your flat. The camel rug, the piles of books and knickknacks, your shadow puppet, a dozen Chinese lamps, the garden overplanted with exuberance. I walk from room to room, opening doors, babbling about tiling and parquet floors. The estate agent suggests a change of decor as April flickers sunlight on your desk. The final envelope, the scrawled address you started, then put aside in your distress. She asks about the bathroom and the loo, a better boiler, which carpets to renew, which curtains. She's professional and nice. We talk about the market and the asking price. It's always worth reading this postscript to it because otherwise it's so sad. Afterthought. In this thumbnail sketch of you, wearing baggy shirts and sunscreen and talking about the war, I've given you perhaps too many tears, too many insufficient dreams, too little laughter and casual sex. I've cancelled out your joy, you'd say, your basso profondo on Tower Bridge that day, London flaneur, taking photographs of billboards, pubs and men, a glove left on a postbox. Extravagant and glorious, your perpetual, and then. So perhaps I could finish by reading this long. If we got time for a long, the Travellers, do you think you can manage that? It's like a bedtime story, so you can close your eyes, you can relax. You might. Oh, Adam, haven't you got to get your train? Oh, yeah, just leave when you. It's a funny thing with this. I can read the first section, but it only makes sense if you hear the whole thing. But it's a story, so it's not too difficult to listen to. So let's finish with this. Does that sound? It does take about 10 minutes to read. It's humongously long. Just slip out if you need to. Adam's got to go and get the train back to the community that we both live in. Okay, and it's a monologue, so I'll have to read it like an actor, except for I'm not one. The Travellers from Orissa. Tapusa said the oxen stood stock still and wouldn't budge, although he slapped their haunches, dragged their stubborn necks. He said they stood and swung their heads and looked around themselves as if a tiger might be roaming. Tapusa said all the birds stopped singing and the day was still, but Tapusa's head was full of yarns. He'd spin a story time and time again. It got more fantastical each time he did, although he'd bridle if you dared to tell him. I've long got used to all his talk. The ox, the birds, the unearthly light making us gape and our neck hairs bristle. Every time he'd add another sight. The four great kings arriving with a magic bowl, a canopy of jewels, a friendly snake wrapped round and round a prince. But it's true we stopped. And it's true that day was still. We left the boy with the cart and the market grain, the oxen tethered up, their sandy hides spotted with light. The sun was going down. It was afternoon. It shone into the trees. I could see the forest edges even now, the light in narrow bands between the trunks, maluva creepers and red cymbali flowers. We found a path. It was rough and hard to tread, with prickly bushes catching on our clothes and leaves high up like shields and warrior spears. We found a level clearing in the wood, a delightful spot, with kusha grass growing under trees and the rushing sound of water. Tapusa said that when we saw the master, I nearly ran, as if I'd seen a ghost or a spirit of the dead. But why should I? I'm not a fool. He was thin, I remember that, and dirty, like a street boy thick with mud. Tapusa jumped in with all the usual questions. What dharma do you teach and what's your caste? He'd shake his head and sigh each time the master answered, but I knew he didn't understand. The master spoke in a funny way, with gaps between the words, as if he'd just been woken from a dream. Tapusa kept on asking foolish questions, so I shut my mouth and went to get some food. I brought the master barley gruel and madhupinda. His smile, I shan't forget, was like gazing at the sea. The sun had set, but the evening sky was bright when we got back to the cart. The journey home was just the same as the journey out, or so I've come to think. Bumps and ridges, the farm boy's sullen face. One thing I do remember, don't ask why, was a heron standing at the edge of a scrubby pond. I'd been sleeping in my seat, and when I woke, my neck was stiff. I shifted up and looked. I don't know what it was about the bird. He seemed so old and sore and so intent on that small meal that he was fishing for. Karangi, my wife, was standing at the door when I got home with the boys around her skirts and the bullock rigged and ready for the fields. We married when we were young and got along much easier than most. She often laughed when Tapusa spoke, which of course he didn't like. He grew impatient with my quiet. He'd crawl round late at night when the boys were long in bed. One time he'd been with the village lads telling tales, all kinds of things, marvels and ghostly visitations, I don't know what. Well, he must have felt ashamed because he came and got me out of bed so we could talk. I wouldn't speak at first, but he looked so hurt. I told him all I remembered of the day, how we'd seen the master under a peepal tree, the way he looked and smiled, the journey home. I was surprised by what I had to say. Tapusa was quiet and we'd stood there in the dark. One time I told Karangi, she'd been pestering for days, so I talked about it straight, how I'd laughed and touched the master's arm, kissed his feet and wept when it was time to leave. After that I'd catch her looking at me strange, so I knew to keep it to myself. I thought it over in the fields, which was where I was happy most, standing behind the plough, with birds riding on the bullock's back, the sun riding the water's edge, and the air thick with midges. That's when it would all come back. Not often, and never when I tried to get it straight. Once when I was lifting up my youngest boy, and once when the sun was low behind the trees. When the feeling came, it hurt around my heart and made me shake and tremble. I'd have to stop. The boys would cluster round and start to cry, throwing down their sticks. Then whatever it was would lift and I'd want to jump for joy. I'd clap the bullock's back, then give the boys a ride. Or I'd fold my hands and fall down in the dust. Tapusa started wearing homespun stirred with clay. He attracted a little following. They came to ask him what he thought and how the crops would fare and who would make a bride. He stopped talking to me about that time. He'd pretend he didn't see me when I passed. I kept my thinking to myself, but Karangi would complain and want to take it up, the rumours he had been spreading. I'd shake my head and she'd relent and go outside to work. Sometimes we'd laugh and be like kids again. We'd do impersonations of his ways, his nodding head, how he held his finger up each time he spoke to emphasise each word. Tapusa said the master sent a deva to teach him Dharma while he slept. He said he heard a voice inside a tree or speaking from a rock. He'd stop and seem to listen. Then he got ill. 10 years ago at least. And near the end, his wife asked me to come. She was waiting at the door when I arrived. She asked about the boys, how grown up they were and tall. The room inside was dark and I could smell the Nishigandha flowers. Tapusa was on his back all dressed in white and someone had hung a train of marigolds around his neck as if he was already dead and living with the gods of the 33. We didn't speak, but I knew what he would have said. Then Karangi died. She'd not been herself for weeks. She kept clutching at her side and screwing up her face, and when I asked her what was wrong, she'd shrug it off and tell me it was nothing. Then once I heard her shouting at the boys. The youngest had broken something or knocked a dish of lentils on the ground. He was always clumsy. And when I came in, she was leaning at the door. I'd never heard her scream like that before. Next day I met them running from the house, telling me to come home straight away. I found her in bed, already cold and curled up on her side, as if having pleasant dreams. Occasionally a merchant would turn up and tell a story, what the master said at such a place, the way he'd talk, how he'd treat a Brahmin's son. I'd go along and listen with the rest, but it didn't make much sense. When I tried to remember when we met, it was like it happened to someone else. It seemed so long ago. So when we heard the news that he was 3 days' walk away with a band of hangers-on, I nearly didn't go. But Magia, my youngest son, got so excited, he put my walking stick into my hand and almost pushed me out the door, despite my aches and troubles. We met all kinds of folks from local towns. I'd stop and tell the story once again, but Magia would complain and said, "We must keep going." I did my best. I went about as fast as I could manage. Paddy fields and coconut trees and scrub are all I remember of the journey, except perhaps the kirka's raucous call. Such lovely wings, such an awful cry. How good it was to be amongst the noise. I felt like I was 20 seasons younger. Stalls laid out, women's carrying pots, bullock carts and tethered buffalo. Hungry crows were waiting on the roost to steal away a scrap, and there were children playing games and getting under my feet. I would have stopped to ask about the price of Malajara, but Magia took me sternly by the elbow among the jostling crowd. When we got to the Ambavana among the banyan trees, we couldn't hear the things the master said for all the buzz of talk. Magia kept on telling them to shush, turning sharply round, pressing his finger to his lips, while young men blocked my view. Eventually we turned our steps back home, Magia dejected, straggling behind. We'd not got far beyond the hawker's cry, the smoke and cooking smells, when there he was, the master, walking a little way ahead with a motley crew of sadhus and disciples. I knew him by the way he moved, slow and even like an elephant or tiger. Magia didn't notice him at first, but I said, "Master," before I knew I spoke. I'd never used the word before. He turned and said, "My name. My name." "Balika," he said. So soft. I felt ashamed. I wept so hard I thought my ribs would break. He said, "Good," and then carried on his way. As a boy, Magia had always been the talkative one. He'd follow me around asking questions, then ask why each time I tried to answer. Karangi used to say, if you'd only put the effort you put into your tongue into your chores, we might get something done. Well, that day, we walked in silence home, Magia looking sidelong with a question written on his face. I tried to talk of other things, some paddy fields we passed, the Kuthukatha starting up, hoopopo, but he saw what I was doing and wouldn't speak. I'd kept the secret feeling to myself ever since that day I'd told Karangi, knowing I'd not be understood and doubting if I would be now. But I was overawed meeting the master and weary from the road, so I opened up my heart, trusting to the gods. Everything was true about the place, I said, the forest grove, the food I went and fetched. But after he had eaten, and after Tapusa had gone through all his questions once again, the master said, I remember every word, I've kept them with me all this time. He said, "Listen, my friends. There is a thorn buried in the heart of man, and for this thorn they suffer here and now and in the future. I have found that thorn and plucked it out, and for me the mass of suffering is no more." Tapusa jumped in saying, yes, but. I could have struck him and quickly said his name, but the Lord, for so he seemed to me just then, looked at him with such a heart of love, I couldn't speak. And then a wonder came and troubled me and worked within my soul, as if I'd rise and shout and stamp my feet. But then I saw Karangi's face, the boys, the village fields I've always known. How could I leave and walk the triple world with him? My heart was like a netted fish, thrown up upon a dusty bank and thrashing wildly. But the master, the happily attained, guide unsurpassed of men to be tamed, the blessed one, richly endowed, he seemed to search inside my heart and urge it forward. I didn't follow the blessed one that day. I left with Tapusa, as I said, and walked back into my life and tried to take it up, the way I've always lived. Only Karangi knew that something deep inside had changed. And soon I found how little I could say. And soon I gave up trying, even with her. Tapusa hadn't understood. He'd turned the whole thing upside down and made it all about himself and how he stood and what he had to say. I'd kept a stubborn silence. And though I've loved my children one and all, Megea best perhaps, and though my life's been blessed, I won't complain. I knew as I climbed inside the cart, the sky still bright above my head and half the journey done, I knew that day that I'd betrayed my life. Now I'm old. I don't know how old. My mother was never clear about that sort of thing. She used to say, you're the same age as your nose and just a few years older than your teeth. Well, I'm sure that I'm the oldest in the village. Nowadays, youngsters come to ask me questions or talk about their fears. I listen or say a word or two, then ask them not to worry. They mostly want to hear about the master, although they've heard it umpteen times before. I usually protest, but if they insist or if they're young, I add the things Tapusa would have said. The snake, the 4 great kings, the crystal bowl of light. I like to watch their faces, how they gasp and put their hands up to their mouths and stare at me in wonder. I have to be careful though. If I miss something out, they stop me and say I haven't got it right. Megea left that day. We met the master. I had to let him, although it broke my heart. Now his wife looks after me. She's good and quiet, and soon she'll bring me yagu before I go to bed. The monsoon rains have started early, drumming on the roof like a herd of angry goats, or an army from the west. It's almost like I'm living in the sea. It's almost like I'm living in the sea. I might be a darting shoal of fish. My mind seems full of roving eyes. At times like this, I think I hear Tapusa preaching Dharma to the village lads, or Karangi singing while she bathes the boys. I hear their squeals coming through the night. And sometimes, when I'm about to fall asleep, I hear the master calling out my name over and over. Balika, Balika, quietly between the drops. I know it's just my mind playing tricks, but I listen nonetheless.